Greetings, wise grasshoppers. I am so happy to be able to provide this for you. Let's talk a little bit about the federal bureaucracy today. It's not just a fun word to say, it's a fun word to spell. And it's an interesting institution because it is not one of the four branches that we know and love, the executive, legislative, or judicial, but it does work with all of them. It can really impact what all of them do, and each of those branches certainly has an impact on what the bureaucracy does. So without further ado, let's take it away. I've included some political cartoons for you over the next few slides to get a general idea of how Americans feel about the bureaucracy. Doesn't this one remind you of the Office episode where Dwight tasks Jim to come up with an assistant for Jim, and Jim ends up choosing Dwight to serve as Jim's assistant to Dwight? Okay, folks, let's talk about how the bureaucracy is actually organized. Before we begin, why don't we just play a little word association? When I say the word bureaucracy, what are some things that you think of? I imagine you probably think of what a lot of Americans think of, and one, you don't know what it is, or two, you feel it's unnecessary, it's confusing, there's a lot of rules, or which some of you may have heard, red tape, created by these government employees that you're sure exist, but there's no way you could recall who they are, if you were just shown a picture of these individuals. You just don't know. But what it is it is an organization. There are departments and agencies within the executive branch, and they're tasked with carrying out laws of the nation. So do you recall what the legislative branch does with laws? They make them. How about the executive branch? They enforce them. Very good. And the bureaucracy helps the executive branch do that. They've got to have a very specific job where they're carrying out a specific task according to a prescribed set of rules and procedures. So a lot of us are are left with wondering, what do we want from our bureaucracy? Most of us know the bureaucracy from disaster relief or lack thereof. And a good way to look at this is to examine or recall the three terrible hurricanes of 2017, Harvey, Irma, and Maria. Harvey bringing up to 60 inches of rain in some areas in Texas. My gosh. Irma totally destroying Key West and going all the way on coastal areas to South Carolina. And then Maria, devastating Puerto Rico. Even folks 6 months later, 40% of them did not have power. And so even though you had large government responses, in part due to the massive public perceived failure of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, following Katrina, you had 31,000 people helping in Harvey, even more in Irma. But really, Americans are left with this question: did the federal government help or hurt the situation? The middle picture, you could certainly say, well, they helped. Look at these people who are being provided with lodging. But then please let me direct your attention to the bottom picture there. It's important to look at the organization and development of the bureaucracy, because really the bureaucracy impacts our lives much more personally than the actions of the president, Congress, or the judicial branch. They really do. I mean, I don't know about you guys. I've never met a president. I have not taken a tour of the White House. I have met a congressperson, but I don't know if you guys have. I've never been to a federal court. But yet these bureaucrats, these officials employed within government agencies, they do more that impacts our daily lives. Creating regulations, demanding safe products, fair labor practices. I'll show you a picture of the Department of Agriculture demanding safe products in just a second. But really, they do quite a bit. For example, if you read the textbook, you saw how alarm clocks, if you guys use one, they comply with time zones and daylight saving times that are set by federal agencies. Also, here's a good example for what some of you might be doing right now. Sleeping. If your mattress, your pillows, your sheets, and your blankets were made in the U.S., it was bureaucrats that made sure the factory was safe for the employees, that the factory did not discriminate when it was hiring individuals, that it dealt with complaints in a fair manner, and it did not degrade the environment. Also, if the bedding was not made in the United States, the bureaucracy makes regulations that the country of origin had to follow, including rules to make the products safe for consumers. So much that drives this is our own demands, what we want from our bureaucracy. Of course, this is U.S. government and politics, so we cannot leave out the political differences. Some people feel as though the government bureaucracy is too big. It's too powerful. It makes life difficult. It makes it expensive. Remember Rick Perry's gaffe that I showed you? He was debating and he said that when he was elected, he would get rid of 3 agencies, 3 departments. One of them was the Department of Energy, which he was the secretary of until just recently. And then other folks feel as though the bureaucracy itself is powerless. It's incompetent, it's wasteful, it's inefficient. So that's a tried and true campaign promise that folks make, is that they're going to reform the bureaucracy. Always, always. But the bureaucracy has grown, obviously. I'll reference that specifically in just a minute, looking at Washington's cabinet. But it's been gradual due to increases in population and boundaries, or very quick when the government has to respond to crises, which has then really increased the size and scope of the bureaucracy. And all of the power comes from Article 2. The president has to execute the law, and the bureaucracy helps them do that. Here you have an image of 2 gentlemen working on behalf of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they're examining bananas. I had a banana this morning, so thank you, Gino and Bob. Even though I'm not in Philly, we appreciate you. So like I said, it's grown. It's grown big time, y'all. Specifically, let's look at Washington and his cabinet. And I've got a picture of Washington and his cabinet officials. So his administration had 3 departments, because if you recall, the Constitution does not mention the cabinet at all. Washington felt it would be a good idea to have people advise him on matters of state, and so that's why he had Thomas Jefferson, who is all the way on the right side, second to the end. And then you had Henry Knox, who is sitting closest to Washington, acting as his Secretary of War. Of course, now we have the Department of Defense, right? And then you've got Hamilton, who is standing up there, the Secretary of Treasury. I'm sure we all remember that from last year with his financial plan. And then they didn't really consider Edmund Randolph as Attorney General to be a member of the cabinet, but of course today the Attorney General is the head of the Department of, anybody? I hope you said Justice at home, because you're right, Justice. These folks were meant to be advisory bodies to the president, and we're going to talk more about the cabinet later, but today there are 15 departments, and then they are all created by Congress over time. Congress has the ability to establish these. And Congress alone, you know, it's just like a law. The president does have to sign it, but Congress gets it started. I just thought you'd like to see when The branches were established and what they do specifically. So we already talked about state, dealing with foreign policy, and advising the president on matters of diplomacy. The Department of Treasury, using the Internal Revenue Service, advising the president on financial, trade, and tax policy. You've got the Department of Defense, overseeing our national defense, obviously. You've got the Department of the Interior, which executes policies dealing with our natural resources, national parks, monuments, and also conducts federal policy with indigenous people through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Then you've got the Department of Agriculture, which executes policy to promote farming. This is where subsidies come out of. They also inspect products for safety. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, where the Attorney General acts as the head of that. It also includes the DEA and the FBI. And then you've got the Department of Commerce and Labor, commerce dealing with trade, also patents, if you ever want to get a patent on an idea that you have. And the Department of Labor, dealing with employees, minimum wage, workplace safety. And if you think of those last couple of departments during the Progressive era, remember the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, it really made the Department of Labor necessary. Then you've got the Department of Health and Human Services, dealing with our entitlement programs, specifically Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, established in 1953. In 1965, you have HUD, Housing and Urban Development. Think of that time period during the Civil Rights Movement, subsidizing housing for low-income Americans and ensuring fair housing practices. You've got the Department of Transportation, the DOT. I have a buddy who works for that. Maybe I could get him to do a question-answer thing with you guys at some point. Looking at highway development and construction, rail and air, travel and commerce. You also have the Department of Energy, energy production and conservation, the Department of Education. Then in 1989, the Departments of Veterans Affairs, self-explanatory, and in 2002, the Department of Homeland Security, protecting the nation from terrorism and responding to natural disasters. Okay, that's just another look at that. If you would like to take a picture, pause this, and you can. I thought you guys might find Trump's cabinet interesting. I know that President Trump and his cabinet get into the news quite often because, like some of you brought up last year, there seems to be a fair amount of turnover. And you are correct. 9 different departments have had turnover for leadership since they were initially confirmed back in 2017, or interestingly enough, 2018 for some. And just to compare that, President Obama did have 2 departments that experienced turnover in his first term. Now, to be fair, President Obama got almost an entirely new cabinet going into his second term as well. So I wrote down the people who aren't here anymore, in case you want to know. The departments that have changed to new leadership is the Department of State, Defense, Interior, Labor, Health and Human Services, Energy, and Homeland Security. Why did I say that's 9? That's 7. Oh, Attorney General, new Attorney General. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 9. Oh, and Veterans Affairs has someone new as well. Okay, since we're talking about the cabinet, we've obviously got to talk about other positions in the bureaucracy and what Andrew Jackson brought to the table. He brought patronage. When you hear patronage, you're talking about filling administrative positions as a reward for support rather than merit. In other words, the person gets the job based on who they know and not based on the job that they can do. And that's frustrating, but yet it happens, okay? It happens. Interestingly enough, though, this did help to standardize procedures since there was so often changes in power, a constant shuffle of people in and out of office. you have to have standard ways of doing things because most likely the folks who are coming in don't really know how to do things. They're just getting the job because of who they know. So that did help us out in standardizing the bureaucracy and what they do. But luckily, this was replaced with a merit-based system. So you now have hiring and promotion that's based on testing results, education, and other sorts of qualifications after the Pendleton Act was passed in 1883. And I've got the Pendleton Act there, just above a picture of Garfield, the cartoon and the president. And can you stop and think about why I've included a picture of Garfield there? So it's because Garfield was assassinated by somebody who believed that they were owed a political job based on patronage. And so Garfield's vice president and, our 21st president, Chester Arthur, decided, you know what, it might be a good idea for us to have some sort of civil service exam, or you get the job based on what you can do. So that's helpful. And guys, I'm a member of the bureaucracy. At the state level I am, and I had to pass a test in order to get a job as a teacher, and I had to have a certain education level. So true, I got the job at Lassiter in part because I had worked with Dr. Ritchie before, and he knew that I was a good teacher, and so still based a little bit off of the fact that I knew him and that was able to get my foot in the door. However, I do believe I earned it based on my merit. Okay, so the question here is, how does having a merit-based system advance the goals of democratic government? So stop and think about that for a second. Well, hopefully you came up with something along the lines of it allows for a broader representation of the public to be there. Also, in terms of a democratic government, a government that's there for the people, the bureaucracy is supposed to be neutral. It's not supposed to be entirely politically driven. So if you've got folks in there who got their job based on merit, perhaps they are going to be unbiased and do what's right for the American people and focus on that rather than having to focus on, re-election, because that's not the case. And if you would like to do a practice FRQ, press pause and take a picture. And you can always send this to me and I will grade it for you. Okay. Let's leave section 7.1 and move on to 7.2, the structure of the bureaucracy. It's a real complex web. It's huge. There's a lot of folks. And, the president appoints top-level bureaucrats who are tasked with directing the agencies, the departments, or their bureaus. Of course, those top levels do require Senate confirmation. So, that's helpful, having people look into their backgrounds and be a little bit more familiar with them. Of course, we've already talked about the main administrative units are the 15 cabinet departments, responsible for major areas of public policy. But of course, Congress sets their funds. And they are appointed by the president, funded by Congress. And they do also experience pressure from interest groups and citizens, which demonstrates how they can be pulled in multiple directions. Okay? But don't forget, if they want to stick to their department and just focus on what they think is right for their department only, what do we call that when they leave what the president wants and just do their own thing? If you said going native, I'm proud of you. This chart's kind of interesting. It shows you the differences in size and expenditures between the cabinet department. On the left, you can see through 2014 which cabinet department had the most people in it. Interestingly enough, it's the two newest ones. But then on the right, you can see the ratio of expenditure to number of employees. Education should make sense to you because of how many Americans benefit from education, right? Okay. This image is showing you how the federal bureaucrats are set up in their hierarchy. So there are 6,500 political appointees in the executive branch. 6,500. Okay? 6,500. It's like 3 pep rally gym fulls of people. And of those, 1,500 require Senate confirmation. Oh my goodness. Most of them are not going to expect to transition from one administration to the next. So you've got to ensure that you've got experience and competent individuals in the position of power. And they do make political calculations, and they want to signal important constituents that they're willing to work with them. So they can certainly be viewed as politicians. At the top, you've got your executive political appointees, your cabinet secretaries, deputy secretaries, if the secretary is, resigns and you need to still have the department running. You have senior executive service beneath that, expected to use their authority to achieve concrete results, and then career civil servants. They're hired based on merit, and their job is protected from political processes, so they can do what they need to do and not have to worry about being re-elected or being confirmed for the most part. All right, so here's some interesting pictures for you. Looking at diversity in cabinet appointments, how diverse have different cabinets been. So you can see on the left, top left, you've got women appointments in cabinet, non-white appointments in the cabinet, and then you have white men at the bottom right. And this is interesting because this shows you how we've really seen the growth of the federal bureaucracy, even as recently as 1950. And part of that, guys, is because we want a set of uniform rules for the economy. And since we want that, we need a greater role of the federal government. Can you imagine 50 different sets of rules, federal rules for businesses? That's ridiculous. So that's why we have one, right? One set of rules that apply to all states coming out of the bureaucracy, and you can find them in the Code of Federal Regulations. And it's something that each year the bureaucratic department will make their adjustments, and they'll put it into the Federal Regulations Code. And so in 1950, you had about 10,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. By 2016, it's looking about 180,000. I thought you might enjoy this. If you do your own taxes, let me know. I'm very lucky that my father-in-law does my taxes. But yeah, not fun. Not fun. If you've applied for financial aid, you filled out FAFSA, you know that those forms can be pretty intense. But of course, when we're talking about the structure of the modern federal bureaucracy, we cannot forget about what role iron triangles and issue networks play. Don't forget the iron triangle does have 3 parts. The bureaucracy is a part. Congress and interest groups are the others, each working with the other 2 to achieve their shared policy goals. And then you've got the issue network, and that's much larger. More groups are involved there. Influence between interest groups, policymakers, and policy advocates. You could have a couple of particular members of Congress that are very passionate about an issue be involved in an issue network. Private companies being involved in an issue network. And they usually address a specific problem and go away after that problem is gone. Interestingly enough, in the 1960s, the iron triangle that the tobacco industry had started to experience many issue networks as you have more and more reports coming out that, oh yeah, smoking is bad. It will kill you. Maybe, just maybe, don't do it. But anyway, here's the iron triangle yet again. I know I've showed it to you a bunch of times. Maybe there's a reason for that. But it does illustrate the linkage of benefits that each of the three members provide to the other two. It's their common interests that the overall policy goal drive individual decisions. So specifically, the bureaucracy here might have favorable oversight for certain interest groups. An interest group might want to see more or less oversight from the bureaucracy, and so in that iron triangle, the bureaucracy will give them more or less. And in return, the interest group says thanks, and so they lobby on behalf of that regulatory agency or of that independent agency like NASA or like the EPA or the Federal Communications Commission. And then in terms of Congress, the bureaucracy might implement a law that was passed with favorable regulations, something that makes Congress happy. And in return, Congress will give them more money in their budget. So here's a couple of questions for you to think about to see if you're getting the information that we're going over here. What are the advantages and disadvantages of policies that protect civil service from termination? So for example, as a civil servant, I am protected from termination just if somebody doesn't like me or because of my political views. They cannot fire me. So why could that be a good thing or why could that be a bad thing? Well, I imagine you're probably thinking along the lines that this means the civil servants are protected from changing politics with changes in administrations. That's true. So if they're doing a good job, they could potentially keep their job. However, there's also the danger that they might be too insulated. If they're performing their job but not doing a good job, they could still keep their job. And that can certainly happen in all professions that are protected in the way that teachers are with tenure. Okay, and so another think for you. In what ways do iron triangles and issue networks benefit and harm representative democracy? So take a second on that. Well, they can benefit because all three entities have a mutual goal and want to see that goal is achieved. So hopefully they work together well and get that done quickly. However, it could harm because that goal might be contrary to what the majority wants. And so that could hinder democratic principles. Okay. Here's another FRQ for you. If you want to press pause and take a picture, please be my guest too now. So let's talk about how the bureaucracy makes their policy. So we know the bureaucracy is the key institution for implementing policy. We know that the president can do this through executive actions. Congress does this with laws. The judicial branch can do this with what is called judicial legislation through rulings that they make. But they're the ones who implement. But it's difficult to get to the implementation process. Because to start with, you've got to define the problem. What is the issue? In the 80s, for the disabled population in the early 90s, the issue was there were not ramps available to all people at public buildings. So they did not literally have access to certain governmental buildings even. So once the problem is defined, you've got to ensure that you get on the policy agenda. You make the politicians care about listening and recognizing that there's a problem too. You've got to get that policy debated. You've got to get that policy passed. It's got to get through committee and the whole floor votes. And then you've got to talk about how the heck you're going to finance it, right? So a long series of events have to take place before the bureaucrats can even do their job and before they can do it effectively. And this just shows you kind of an example of that. Let's start with the blue dot of defining the problem. Again, you've got to get on the agenda. You've got to form and adopt the policy. Somebody actually has to write it out who knows what they're talking about, hopefully. It's always fun for educators when folks who aren't educators write laws that pertain to educators. Budgeting is going to be a hurdle that you've got to jump over or deal with at some point in time. And then, of course, you implement the policy, and we'll talk more about this momentarily. Then you got to evaluate the policy you've implemented. Did it do a good job? If it did, maybe you keep it for a while, or you terminate it. Or if it didn't do a good job, what was the problem yet again? The bureaucracy's main function is to implement, to put into action the laws that Congress has passed, to get the job done. But of course, this can be complicated. This requires technical knowledge, not just political knowledge. A lot of these bureaucrats are interacting directly with citizens. Sometimes we call them street level bureaucrats, and that would be me. Hello. Police, teachers, social workers. But the problem with these kind of folks is, since they're not focusing on political stuff, getting reelected or constantly pleasing people, and they, care more about their job, maybe sometimes they think they can bend the rules to get the job done. A good example of this might be, in my 15 years of teaching, I have come across a few individuals who just ignored teaching standards, right? They just said, well, the state of Georgia says I have to teach this. I pretty much do that anyway. I'm not going to look at these. But the problem is the test that we give you guys is standards based. So, that could become an issue, right? But sometimes new policies that Congress makes are introduced into a body of existing policies. So that's frustrating. Okay, so what do you just give up some and adopt new ones? So that's a problem. And the new policies can be vague, which means that the definition of things, the procedure of things, is then left up to the agencies. And we call this bureaucratic discretion. Okay, that's where the bureaucrats have power to decide how a law is actually going to be implemented. And it's good that they have technical and specialized knowledge. This kind of also allows them, with vague policies, flexibility to handle any unforeseen circumstances. They've got to figure out what Congress meant when it was passing a law, what Congress wanted when it was passing a law. And so then they have the opportunity to come up with regulations, okay? So that's how the federal bureaucracy fills in those critical details that are missing in a law. But here's the takeaway, guys. Are you paying attention? If you've wandered off into la-la land, pay attention now. Regulations carry the same weight as laws, presidential actions, and judicial decisions. That's huge. That is huge. And when they make regulations, they're required to give notice and comment. Here's an example. The Food and Drug Administration is going to announce rules and allow interested parties to weigh in. They also need to notify the president and Congress about potential impacts that something could have. So to make adjustments to some sort of, environmental output for factories, they could say, well, these changes are going to cost this much money, but it's going to save these many lives. You know what I'm saying? And then they publish their regulations in the Federal Register. Okay, so let's talk about some of the groups specifically. I know we've already talked about the executive departments like the cabinet a lot. Executive agencies are independent agencies operating within the executive branch, like the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That's a part of the Department of Justice. And then you have independent regulatory commissions. Usually they end with the word commission, and they're usually regulating some aspect of the economy, okay? And lastly, you have government corporations. These are corporations that could be public, but instead they're owned by the government. And the USPS is a great example of that. Okay, so let's look at independent regulatory agencies and independent executive agencies. You've got over 100 agencies of the national government with regulatory powers. Most of these are in the executive branch, like the EPA. Again, their regulatory powers have the force of law, just like executive actions and judicial decisions. However, the top officials do serve at the pleasure of the president, so that means they can be, hired and fired by the president. They do, require Senate confirmation, though, a lot of them. And then you've got 20 independent regulatory commissions, and these are interesting. They serve set terms. They're supposed to be insulated from direct political influence. They're supposed to be bipartisan, or non-partisan, even better. The Federal Communications Commission is a good example of this. The commissioners serve for set terms, like I said, making them more insulated from political influence. Here's some additional examples of federal independent regulatory agencies. Notice how most of them end in commission, and those are the ones that I told you are supposed to be insulated from direct political influence, serving set terms, etc. So you've got the Federal Trade Commission. In 34, both the FCC and the SEC were established. The FCC, Federal Communications Commission, because of all the new broadcast media, and they wanted to ensure what was reaching the American public was legit and fair and accurate. And then the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, wow, can you imagine how they're dealing with what's happening right now? The EPA and the Federal Election Commission of 1974, monitoring public campaigns, contributions, that sort of thing. Okay, don't forget about that Interstate Commerce Commission, remember that, that regulated the railroads from the Pullman strike, where Cleveland essentially shut down the strike because he claimed they were interfering with mail. They were, but he was siding with the businesses, the big business, as opposed to the workers. Okay, now let's also look at the executive office of the president, the EOP. That is another part of the bureaucracy I want to make sure you know. So the EOP was created by Congress in 1939, and FDR asked for it to assist the president in running federal departments and agencies. It includes the National Security Council, and I've got a chart at the bottom there for you to show you who makes up the National Security Council. It's a bunch of the cabinet heads, as well as the White House Chief of Staff, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of National Drug Control Policy, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the military. You also have the Council of Economic Advisors. They are an advisory group of economic policy. So they're very important in assisting the president in ensuring that they do their job well. And you also have the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. This is the group that basically puts together the budget on behalf of the president and then submits it to Congress. And of course, the budget for the fiscal year begins on October 1. So they advise the president about government agencies, how much to budget, what kind of work they're doing. And so different agencies will appeal to the Office of Management and Budget specifically for an increase in their budget. I believe some of you guys are doing that if you're doing one of those assignments that I gave you to go with this week's material. Alrighty, this just shows you a more detailed look at the EOP, who is in the Executive Office of the President. Like I told you, there's the Office of Management and Budget, the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, along with some others. So just take a look at that. Alrighty, and the White House staff, another part of the bureaucracy that you should know. These are chief aides and staff for the president and the White House. There's 3 types of offices, those in the political office, policy office, and support services. This includes the chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, lawyers, speechwriters for the president. They are viewed as loyal to the president alone, and none of them need Senate confirmation, yet they're doing the vast majority of work every day for the president. Whoopsies. They are relied on to give opinions of things, analysis, information, and they really set the tone for the White House. And there you have President Trump and his chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, who also was the acting head of the Office of Management and Budget before he accepted this job. And these just show you principal offices in the White House staff. The First Lady also has her own staff, as does the Vice President. And they have counselors, speechwriters, media affairs, communications, political affairs, public engagements. They have secretaries, executive clerks, people in charge of visitors, photographs, records, maintenance, the kitchen, and then the policy offices that include many from the executive office of the president, as I mentioned earlier. This is an interesting article. If you want to read it, I'll be happy to post a link to the bureaucracy folder, looking at the cabinet versus what the White House staff does. And then finally, like I mentioned earlier, government corporations. These provide services for a fee that could be handled by the private sector, but they are known for charging cheaper rates because they're, government corporations. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a good example. The USPS is an example. Amtrak, if you've ever ridden on that train service before. Public Broadcasting, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, for the banks. That's always good. Okay. The politics of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy does act as a court on occasion to settle disputes between 2 parties. And this is called bureaucratic adjudication. All right? Must know that, must know that, must know that. So there can be disputes that arise over implementation. And so the bureaucrats using this power determine what groups are covered under a regulation or a program. Also under this power, they can issue fines or penalties for violators. And just so you know, there's an example at the top for you. Bureaucrats are restricted from engaging in political campaigns. They cannot campaign on behalf of someone. They cannot run for partisan office. And that's due to the Hatch Act. Just FYI. Okay, and let's evaluate what they're doing, or, if they're doing a crap job, terminate it. Evaluation basically just means that they're determining if a policy is achieving what it meant to do, okay? Congress is going to weigh in, state legislatures are going to weigh in, federal and state courts, academic institution, policy entrepreneurs, all sorts of folks can weigh in, but it's Congress that has the authority to formally terminate a policy. Also, SCOTUS can terminate a policy using judicial review if they find something to be unconstitutional. Maybe if the EPA requires factories to make some sort of change, it's just going to be too expensive and not necessary. Okay? So your think question here is, what are the dangers in allowing an unelected bureaucracy to make rules and adjudicate whether or not those rules have been broken? So why don't you stop and think about that for a minute. You can listen to Wyatt snore if you like. So, guys, one of the key criticisms with bureaucrats is just how much discretion they have over regulatory policy. Most policies that are coming out of Congress are vague when they're dealing with how to execute. So the bureaucrats fill in those gaps, but please keep in mind, they're not elected by the people. So when the people are held accountable to bureaucratic standards, sometimes they can feel like they're not fair because they didn't have a say in those policies. Kind of goes back to the idea of no taxation without representation, right? Here's a FRQ. If you want to stop, take a picture of it, go for it. Okay, so there are checks on the bureaucracy. They can't do whatever they want to do, and we check them through control, oversight, and reform. Also, individual bureaucrats themselves may undermine effective regulation for their own self-interest, looking the other way, so we want to make sure that we keep an eye out for that. So what the president can do specifically, they have formal control. They're the ones who can appoint and remove individuals at those top layers. Obviously, this is based on the individual's willingness to comply with what the president wants. Also, the president writes a budget. So the president doesn't have to give a lot of budget to a agency that they don't like. For example, President Trump has said that he's not an EPA fan. So he's going to try to eviscerate their budget. And the lower levels can be harder to control, but not the big ones for the POTUS. I've got a funny example for you here. I love this story. This is from your book. So in having a battle with the bureaucracy, Jimmy Carter really found out that he had an issue that presidents have had ever since Eisenhower in the White House, and that's mice. Isn't that creepy? So with maintenance personnel unable to control the mouse population, Carter called on the bureaucracy. But the Department of the Interior said that the mice were a problem for the General Services Administration because the Interior was only responsible for the grounds of the White House, but not the building itself. But the GSA, the General Services Administration, said, no, the problem is interiors, since the mice were obviously migrating from outside. So Jimmy Carter actually had to order an immediate meeting in his office of all concerned officials of, are you ready for this? The GSA, the Department of the Interior, White House administrators, and others before any progress was made on the mouse problem. Ooh, yuck, gross. So here's a little political cartoon. Why don't you press pause and take a picture of this and analyze it. And so what would you say the viewpoint of the cartoon is here? First off, what is that? That's an octopus, essentially, but it's red tape, and it's wrapping its tentacles around the U.S. So I imagine that Eric Alley isn't really a fan of the bureaucracy, right? So a rather cynic view of the bureaucracy, that it's strangling the life out of the United States. It's out of control. Then you're supposed to explain how the cartoon relates to the federal bureaucracy rather than state bureaucracies. And I mean, it's squashing them, right? Might as well be squirting ink. Do octopuses squirt ink, or is it just squids? I don't know. And why the cartoonist chose a red octopus to represent the bureaucracy, I believe we already answered that. Is anybody reminded of the political cartoon of Standard Oil as an octopus? I hope so. And one reason why most cartoons about the bureaucracy are negative, because they only make the news if something bad happened. And that's most Americans' perceptions, right? Congress can really check the bureaucracy, absolutely. Don't forget the Senate has to confirm top positions. Congress can terminate agencies or create agencies or programs. They can give them money, and they also can oversee what's happening through hearings. So members of the bureaucracy might be required to testify before Congress, justifying what they've done. In fact, there is this actual group called the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, who monitors if funds are being spent appropriately. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, they gave a detailed list of evaluations and suggestions for the future. They called out failed leadership, communication, and coordination. And so to do this, they serve as a safeguard against future mistakes, and they can hold bureaucrats accountable for actions. Here's a quote from your book. The American people don't care about acronyms or organizational charts. They want to know who was supposed to do what, when, and whether the job got done. And if it didn't get done, they want to know how we're going to make sure it does get done next time. When you're looking at what impact the judicial branch and the media have, Judicial decisions can restrict and constrain the scope of accepted bureaucratic actions. They can. Here's an interesting SCOTUS case, Michigan versus the EPA. The EPA placed limits on mercury, arsenic, and acidic gases emitted by coal-fired power plants. And the private sector challenged this because complying with this was going to be very expensive. The costs were estimated to be near $9.6 billion. But the EPA said that it would prevent 11,000 premature deaths and 130,000 asthma cases. But Justice Scalia, writing the majority opinion, determined that the EPA's interpret of the 1970 Clean Air Act was unreasonable. In terms of the media, public opinion rarely constrains bureaucratic behavior because the media doesn't report on it unless it's bad, right? They rarely cover the day-to-day. If there is a disaster, then that independent agency like FEMA becomes center stage. In fact, 31% of Americans approved of how FEMA and the government handled Hurricane Katrina. So, the government has, in the past, relied on private organizations or attempted to reform, right? During Katrina, federal reliance on private contractors was questioned. There wasn't really a ton of help from the federal government, which was illustrated by private organizations stepping up. I'll show you a picture in just a second. Habitat for Humanity is one of them. Walmart is another one. But it's not always positively viewed. Maybe sometimes there's some folks who came down to make money and not help, right? Like your book talked about an example of a company giving bus tours of Karina damage and donating some of their profit. That's nice. Americans do want effective and strong implementation of policy, but they don't want those unelected bodies to be too strong. See, there's Walmart trying to come and help out residents of the Gulf Coast with supplies and water. And FEMA actually turned them away, by the way. So the last think question for you, why is it difficult for the president and Congress to control the bureaucracy despite the tools that they have to do so? For one, there's just so much. There's too much to keep up with, guys. And if the American people are used to having something there, they don't want to see it taken away. Congress would have to assume the power to do something that the bureaucracy has been doing for a long time. They don't want to be just seen as partisan and firing people because they disagree with them. So it can be a problem. And there's one last free response for you. Okay, guys, that's the bureaucracy. I hope that helped. We will talk tomorrow, Wednesday, about the reading guide, which really follows this PowerPoint pretty closely. So hope you did that. Bring it with you to our discussion tomorrow, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.